Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my sermon. And this is Easter. Easter sermons are usually pretty personal. Easter sermons deal with death, and deal with loss, and deal with the centrality of the Christian hope. So some of this stuff, I don't know how well it'll go with the whole audience, but we're doing, of course, services sort of online, which at Living Stones means me doing a lot more things, sort of like I already do on video on my personal channel. The church stuff is over on the church channel, and you can find a link to the church channel below. It's always down below in the standard group of links that I put under most of my videos. So many of us had hoped we could be together for Easter, and we had a council meeting Thursday night, and I probably didn't appreciate until the council meeting, just in terms of we're doing council meetings on Zoom, and all of the church council members are weekly phone calls to all the members of the church and people who attend the church and in our church community as such, and just had a real sense of the loss. No families getting together, no celebrations, and yeah, the shelter at home order came down on March 18. The last service at Living Stones was March 8. We closed the week before that. It's been lonely. The Sunday after the 15th was we didn't have services, and it's been a lonely quiet as sort of a new normal. And personally, I probably wasn't prepared for how much I miss being together with the church on Sunday mornings as well as during the week. Even though I, unlike some in my congregation, I've got 4 other people living in my house, my wife and 3 of my children, so we're by no means lonely there. But people I very much care for, talk to on the phone, maybe even a video chat, but it's not the same. It's sort of like a death of the old, but without all the rituals of grief. Easter's past are just such. There's something special about an Easter service. There's a special life to it. There's a special vibrancy to it. And when I look at, and I don't take near enough pictures on Sunday as I should, but this picture was, my kids are fairly small. They're grade school age in this picture. And I see a number of people who have since passed away. And you just have a sense of time. Here's, my oldest son playing with another good friend of the family who was learning bass at the time, and Ben, who's moved up to Oregon. Joe, Nina still leads on worship, and you can find her on the videos. Joe, at the end, passed away a number of years ago. And the other picture here is older still, and I see Nina's mother, and I see Dorothy Watkins and Pat Roberts. Great, great people. Taught me so much when I was a young pastor, and these old women they would tell me, you young kid, you don't know squat. Let us teach you something about life. And these women just were wonderful. Just were wonderful. And I see some of the people in that picture who are still living, dramatically changed. That picture's probably 20 years ago. I've been at this church 22 years. And then pictures here of Neil and Dottie and Jack and Joe. Such good friends. Such saints. They're gone. I think about Patterson. There's pictures from the 70s. Patterson Easter was, twice as many people would show up for church because, Patterson, the first ward where my father pastored, most of the folks there had, come up from the South between the wars or after World War II, and were looking for jobs and new life in the North, but they still had those Southern habits. So they'd dress up for Easter Sunday, and kids that you wouldn't see all the rest of the year, they'd show up in their Easter best, and you'd haul out the tables, and we'd have a the potluck picture might not have been Easter, but it captures the sense of Northside Chapel in the 1970s in Paterson, New Jersey. There was a real sense that there was something special going on there, and white folks and black folks up from the South and white folks from different areas of the country and the world who didn't know anything, just learning about new people and building new relationships. And Easter was a crazy, wild, frenzied thing. Now we have COVID Easter, and no family get-togethers, no egg hunts. A pandemic comes through, something we didn't expect. But why don't we expect it? Why are we surprised? I found this video. Not a Christian man. I don't know what kind of stuff that this guy deals in, but he had spent years doing as a counselor to hospice people, I think in Ontario or someplace in Canada. Learned a lot about death. And he said, we think we know we're all going to die, but we don't act like we know it because we don't really know it. And those of you watching my online videos, you think about Vervaeke's 4 Ps of knowing. If you knew that there was enough food and toilet paper, would you really go and hoard things at Costco? The knowledge that you have is, as Jordan Peterson said, such a thin thing. The real knowledge, our real knowledge is betrayed by our actions and our emotions. And this guy talked about the fact that how many people he'd see going into that place and they'd be dying and they'd say, no, I didn't think it would come upon us so soon, so suddenly. And he's like, what about living don't you understand? And he noted that, well, he's talking about Canadians there, but North Americans, they act so surprised and offended that their human rights are violated by the intrusion of things that are beyond their control, that simply don't ask their permission for anything. Really? This surprises us? It just displays just how outstanding and exceptional our lives in this country really are. C.S. Lewis noted this back in the 1940s when suddenly the Russians got the bomb and everyone was freaking out. As long as we had it on our side, that was okay. And Lewis wades in and says, what kind of a world did you think you were living in? And he's talking about, before 1914, everything was grand. But of course, C.S. Lewis was drafted into the Great War and was wounded in the war, and the right kind of wound that would mean that he served out the rest of the war in a hospital and survived the war. And he makes the comment, he said, what did you think nature is? We at once, when we have been waked, that the important question is not whether an atomic bomb or a pandemic is going to obliterate civilization. The important question is whether nature is a thing studied by the sciences, is the only thing in existence. Because if you answer the question yes to the second question, then the first question only amounts to asking whether the inevitable frustration of all human activities may be hurried on by our own action instead of coming at its natural time. That is, of course, a question that concerns us very much, even on a ship, which will certainly sink sooner or later. The news that the boiler might blow up now will not be heard with indifference by anyone. And so a pandemic comes along and Easter services stop and no Easter egg hunts, no getting together with friends and family, no dressing up for church, none of this. And suddenly we feel like our rights are violated. And Lewis says, do you not pay attention to life in this world? Have we had it just so good that we have lost touch with reality? Now, a bunch of the people that I make videos about are everyone's, well, there's got to be a plan B because these people are not quite as disconnected from nature and life as many of the rest of us. There's climate change, there's the possibility of nuclear war, or there's the slow numb of decadence that basically keeps us busied and frenzied, eyeballs glued to Netflix and the newspapers until suddenly death crops up and it's like, me? Now? Really? No, I haven't had enough time. No one gave me warning. but you aren't even going to last that long as climate change or nuclear war in all likelihood. And Lord willing, for most of us, this COVID-19 will spare the lot of us. And then, of course, oh, please let me die in my sleep or surrounded by loved ones. And that's really part of the horror here, that in some of the few cases where I know people have died in my extended network, the horror realization that they are separated from their loved ones, and hoping that maybe there's a hospital chaplain or a nurse who will sit by their bed in their last minutes and not just have someone put the TV on. We were distracted by the politics. We thought that nothing could get our attention away from Donald Trump or the upcoming elections or whatever he said now or the Chinese or this or that. Did we imagine that a new leader with new guns or new tanks and would somehow make the world right? Last week was just Palm Sunday and Jesus rides in and, oh, well, who knows what Jesus will do when he comes to Jerusalem? Who knows what he will do? Well, if you read the Gospels before they even headed down that way, his arrest and execution was really no surprise. Someone who dies the death of a slave, cast as the maker and master of the world. The next day, the one after the preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, the deceiver said, that's Jesus, of course, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go make the tomb as secure as you know now. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting a guard. It seems Jesus' enemies took Jesus a little more seriously than even his disciples. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the 1st day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning and his clothes were white as snow, and the guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. So, Jesus in the tomb is supposed to be dead. They roll away the stone, but there's no indication in any of the gospel accounts that Jesus needed the stone to be rolled away. He later shows up in a room with a door locked. Why would they roll away the stone? Why would they bother to do all of this? The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid." Now, what's interesting here? What's interesting here is that the guards are all lying around like dead men, and the women are still alive, still terrified, of course. Do not be afraid. It seems to be the most common admonition given by heavenly messengers when they show up in the Bible. Do not be afraid. It's like, well, turn down the wattage. The earthquake, the stone, the people coming from heaven, yeah, it'd scare anyone. Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen. You don't have to go in there and shake him and wake him up. And no. He's not here. He's risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he laid. Oh, that's why you roll away the stone. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you. Mission accomplished. So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples because they don't know what to think. Suddenly Jesus met them. Greetings, he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, Nobody pays attention to these little details. They worshiped him. They're doing what? They're worshiping Jesus. Why are they worshiping Jesus? They're Jews. They know not to worship a man. They're worshiping Jesus. You'll find that later in the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew, which more than the other Gospels is written so intentionally to a Jewish audience. They worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid." Just like the angel said, "Do not be afraid. I'm risen. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." Well, the angel had already told them. Why does Jesus show up to tell them the same thing? They need to hear it from Jesus. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Now, of course, this launches a world of debate about the first 5 minutes. In a secular age, the big focus is, well, did he or didn't he? And it's an important question. Because as Paul notes in 1 Corinthians 15, if he didn't, well, it's not just a story about good feelings and Easter bunnies and coming around again. Obviously, if you believe it's a lie or a hoax or a legend, you're back to facing nature. Because it will come for you and yours. It always does. None of us get out of here alive. Denial and avoidance, which is with our wealth and our entertainment, that our culture is so adept at offering, until we are surprised and offended by the inevitable. We thought somehow we would be exempt. C.S. Lewis points out that, well, he says this: when modern writers talk about resurrection, they usually mean one particular moment, the discovery of the empty tomb and the appearance of Jesus just a few yards away. The story of that moment is what Christian apologists now chiefly try to support and skeptics chiefly try to impugn. But this almost exclusive concentration on the first 5 minutes or so of the resurrection would have astonished the earliest Christian teachers. In claiming to have seen the resurrection, they are not necessarily claiming to have seen that. The guards are laying like dead men. Some of them had, some of them had not. It had no more importance than any of the other appearances of the risen Jesus, apart from the poetic and dramatic importance which the beginning of things must always have. What they were claiming was that they had, at one time or another, met Jesus during the 6 or 7 weeks that followed his death. Sometimes they seem to have been alone when they did so, but on one occasion 12 of them saw him together. On this occasion that I read in the Gospel of Matthew, at least 2 women. And on another occasion, about 500 of them, where Matthew says, and some worshipped, and some doubted. So St. Paul says that the majority of the 500 were still alive when he wrote the first letter of the Corinthians in about 55 AD. So not a lot of time for a legend. The resurrection to which they bore witness was, in fact, not the action of rising from the dead, but the state of having risen, a state, as they held, attested by intermittent meetings during a limited period, except for the special and in some ways different meeting vouchsafed by St. Paul. This termination of the period is important, for as we shall see, there is no possibility of isolating the doctrine of the resurrection from that of the ascension. You'll have to wait for that teaching until Ascension Sunday, which will come, Lord willing. That Christ passed from death, passing after death, so as no man had passed before, neither into a purely, that is, negatively spiritual mode of existence, nor into a natural life, just as we know, but into a life which has as its own a new nature. Remember C.S. Lewis talking about life in the atomic age, that, well, if all there is the nature you know, then, it doesn't really matter whether you're entertaining yourself and living in denial of death. It comes, just like a pandemic. Andrew Sullivan notes in his commentary this week, of all the lessons that plagues teach us, surely the most valuable one is humility. Look around you, the most advanced, sophisticated, and wealthy civilization ever to exist on planet Earth. Our glorious, multinational, globalized, technological miracle has now been brought to a screeching halt by a pathogen so tiny no one who is able to see their complex structure. No one was able to see their complex structures until the last century. For all our unparalleled wealth and knowledge, our streets are empty, our businesses for the most parts are suspended, and our efficiency and technological mastery have been mocked by a speck of nature. This minuscule organism that isn't even technically alive could, all by itself, generate a global depression unlike any since the 1930s. Later on, and this is the truth about reality, it really does exist. Whatever the postmodernists might argue, it's complicated, and even if it can't be ignored or forgotten in our very human discourses, it will win in the end. This virus is, in a way, a symbol of that reality, of that nature. It can be stymied for a while, it can be suppressed and avoided, it can be controlled so it doesn't overwhelm us in one fell swoop, metastasizing the damage. But it is unbeatable, and it is winning this war. It is always going to do, as it is always going to do, and only a vaccine can make a real difference. But just a vaccine for this one thing. There'll be another. The coming months will be an unsatisfying series of starts and stops as we struggle to live with it. We are not, in other words, fighting and winning this war. We are merely negotiating the terms of our surrender to reality. And there is nothing more humbling for humans than that, and nothing more clarifying either. The records represent Christ as passing after death, as no man had passed before, neither into a purely, that is, negatively spiritual mode of existence, nor into a natural life, such as we know, but into a life that has its own new nature. It represents him as withdrawing 6 weeks later into some different mode of existence. We don't know what. He says that he goes to prepare a place for us. This presumably means that he is about to create that whole new nature which will provide the environment or conditions for his glorified humanity and in him for ours. The picture is not that we expected, though whether it is less or more probable and philosophical on that account is another question. It is not a picture of an escape from any or every kind of nature, capital M, into some unconditioned and utterly transcendent life. It is the picture of a new human nature and a new nature in general. It is creation 2.0 that is begun in his resurrected body. We must indeed believe the risen body to be extremely different from the mortal body, but the existence as in a new state of anything that could in any sense be described as body at all involves some sort of spatial relation, and in the long run, a whole new universe. That is the picture. Not an unmaking, but a remaking. The old field of space, time, matter, and the senses is about to be weeded, dug, and sown into a new crop. We may tire of that old field, but God is not. He goes on, but entropy by its very character assures that though it may be it might be a universal rule in the nature we know, it cannot be universally absolute. If a man says Humpty Dumpty is falling, you see at once that it is not a complete story. The bit that you have been told implies both to a later chapter in which Humpty Dumpty may have reached the ground, and an earlier chapter in which he is still seated on the wall. A nature which is running down cannot be the whole story. A clock can't run down unless it has been wound up. Humpty Dumpty can't fall off a wall which has never existed. If a nature which disintegrates order were the whole of reality, where would she find any order to disintegrate? Thus, in any view, there must have been a time when the process, the reverse of whose we now see, were going on, a time of winding up. The Christian's claim is that those days are not gone forever. Humpty Dumpty is going to be replaced on the wall, at least in the sense that what has died is going to recover life. probably in the sense that the inorganic universe is going to be reordered. Either Humpty Dumpty will never reach the ground, being caught in mid-fall by the everlasting arms, or else, when he reaches it, he will be put together again and replaced in a new and better wall. Admittedly, science discerns no king's horses and no king's men who can put Humpty Dumpty back together again, but you would not expect her to. She is based on observation, and all our observations are observations of Humpty Dumpty in mid-air. They do not reach either the wall above or the ground below, much less the king with his horses and his men hastening towards that spot. What is C.S. Lewis trying to say? He is saying that to understand Jesus is not a denial of creation 1.0. Jesus is a glimpse into a new creation, and that new creation begins with him, and the old creation and the new creation are indeed not separated, but at this point, unfinished. I think C.S. Lewis speaks best of this in his last of the books of the Narnia series, called The Last Battle. After the children watch a hopeless war and watch their friends lose and die, Aslan steps in. "I see," she said at last, thoughtfully. "I see now this garden is like the stable. It is far bigger inside than it is outside." No, that didn't start with Harry Potter or Doctor Who. "Of course, daughter of Eve," said the fawn. "The further up and further in you go, the bigger everything gets. The inside is larger than the outside." Lucy looked hard at the garden and saw that it was not really a garden, but a whole world, with its own rivers and woods and sea and mountains. But they were not strange. She knew them all. Now, why is C.S. Lewis writing a book to children? Because in many ways, we are children looking at the resurrection, and we don't understand. The best we can do is like the women at the tomb. We're told, don't be afraid. They grab onto Jesus when they see him, and he says, don't be afraid. And they can't quite figure out what's going on, but it slowly begins to dawn on them. But it is not a making of them of their own. "I see," she said. "This is still Narnia, and a more real and a more beautiful, and more real and more real and more beautiful than the Narnia down below, just as it was more real and more beautiful than the Narnia outside the stable door. I see, world within world, Narnia within Narnia." "Yes," said Mr. Tumnus, who we meet in the first book. "Like an onion, except that as you continue to go in and in, each circle is larger than the last," which of course is opposite an onion, for which each one is smaller. Lucy looked this way and that, and soon found that the new and beautiful things that happened to her, whatever she looked at, however far away it might be, once she had fixed her eyes steadily on it, became clearer and closer. Notice the change in consciousness. As if she were looking through a telescope. She could see the whole southern desert, and beyond it the great city of Tashbaan. To the east she could see Cair Paravel on the edge of the sea, and the very window of the room that had been once her own. And far out to sea she could discover the islands after islands, to the end of the world, and beyond the end the huge mountain which she had called Aslan's country. But now she saw that it was a part of a great chain of mountains which ringed round the whole world. In front of her it seemed to come quite close. Then she looked to her left and saw what she took to be a great bank of brightly covered cloud, cut off from them by a gap. But she looked, and she looked harder, and saw that it was not a cloud at all, but a real land, and there she had fixed her eyes on one particular spot. She at once cried out, "Peter! Edmund! Come look! Come quickly!" And they came and looked, for their eyes also had become like hers. "Why?" Peter exclaimed. "It's England! You're in a book about Narnia. How could you see England? And it's that house itself, Professor Kirk's old home in the country where all of our adventures began. I thought that the house had been destroyed, said Edmund. So it was, says the faun. But you are now looking at England within England, the real England, just as this is the real Narnia. And in that inner England, no good thing is destroyed. Suddenly they shifted their eyes to another spot, and then Peter and Edmund and Lucy gasped with amazement and shouted out and began waving. For there they saw their father and mother, waving back at them across the great, deep valley. It was like when you see people waving at you from the deck of a big ship when you are waiting on the quay to meet them. But how can we get to them? Said Lucy. That's easy, said Mr. Tumnus. That country and this country, all the real countries, are only spurs jutting out from the great mountains of Aslan. We have only to walk along the ridge, upward and inward, till it joins on. And listen, there's King Frank's horn. We must all go up. And soon they found themselves all walking together, and a great bright procession it was, up towards the mountains, higher than you could see in this world, even if they were there to be seen. But there was no snow on these mountains. There were forests and green... No snow, you got to remember the first book. Then there were forests and green slopes and sweet orchards and flashing waterfalls, one above the other, going up forever. When we look at these old pictures, we see windows into past Easters. We see children who are no longer small. We see friends who are no longer with us. We see some of us who were young and fit and able, now broken down by illness or sin or one tragedy or another. And we know that in this Nature 1.0, even this COVID Easter is a sign of things to come. If the Lord tarries, living stones will close. The building will go away. The place will remember it no more. But communion was anticipation of a better communion. The musicians just now learning their craft. The food, just the beginnings of a far better banquet that will come someday. The uneasy relationships filled with complexity and difficulty by the things we do to each other, just beginning to learn what it means to actually relate to another human being. Loved ones lost in creation 1.0 are remade, are resurrected, just like their master. Our celebrations are first fruits. They're just tastes and windows. They look miniature. They look small. But as we have new eyes and continue to see in them, we understand that real Patterson, real Sacramento, the places of your youth, those real things are not taken out by nature. God loves them and has plans for them. The kinds of plans that we ourselves are not smart enough to construct, just like we're not great builders in this world. The stuff we make falls apart. Now you might say, wow, but I can't believe it. That's a beautiful vision. It's a beautiful idea. And in fact, I In some of those debates, I hear atheists say things like, "Well, I would get bored," and well, maybe the Lord is sparing you from participation in this. But I believe in Easter. Well, how do you believe? Even if you want to believe, how do you believe? Well, in a land like this, it involves training. In many lands in the history of the world, you didn't have to train much because death was always around you. But in this land of wonder and profit and amusement and endless distraction, it might take a little bit more discipline. You're going to have to start acting like the story is true. You're going to have to start believing that there's a realer Narnia and a more real Sacramento and a more real Patterson and a more real you that is partly, but not entirely, yours to construct, just like you are not really yours to construct. If you want to believe, you have to begin. You have to begin living into that new world. And that involves knowing about your death. It involves believing in the one who didn't have to die, but took on our flesh and did. And in the process, transformed our flesh into a new creation and is leading us into where he has already trod. Now again, you might say that's inspiring, and it is. If you want to believe it, you're going to have to live into it.